I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today you have convinced me to do another work of science fiction from Ken Liu's collection, Invisible Planets, which, despite the fact that I hate science fiction with a capital H, I'm really enjoying.
And it's hilarious that you keep saying that because there's so many exceptions to what you've just said. Like, I hate science fiction. Well, unless it's Kurt Vonnegut, and that's cool. I like Star Wars, too, you know. So besides Kurt Vonnegut and Star Wars, we have, apparently so far, Invisible Planets, which I still recommend to people to pick up. It's one of a couple of anthologies published, mostly translated by Ken Liu. The story we're talking about today is by Xia Jia, and it is called 100 Ghosts Parade Tonight. Now, before we talk about it, I want to mention one or two interesting things about the author, Xia Jia. First of all, she started out studying atmospheric sciences and then did a PhD in comparative literature. So shout out to a fellow compilator, right?
You know, Rob, I actually did a degree in physics before I got my degree in comparative literature, and then went on to see the light and join a East Asian Languages and Literature program.
Yeah, I know. This is why I don't include you among our proud fraternity, because you think it's all BS. So, also, I should point out that you have to stop telling people you got a degree in physics because your wife is tired of hearing that you got a degree in physics. Didn't she ask me that once? She said, I think she or you, somebody were like, hey, ask, I think you did. You told me you majored in this, and you said, hey, you should mention to Lisa that I told you that, because she's like, oh my gosh, enough. So anyway, the only other thing I wanted to mention about Xia Jia, because I think it's really interesting, in 2014, she became the first PhD in China, and I'm quoting verbatim from Ken Liu's introduction, with a specialization in science fiction. I had no idea. That's really cool to be the first person to kind of blaze the trail here, and then also write it, which is pretty sweet. The story we're talking about, 100 Ghosts Parade Tonight, is weird. Would you agree, Lee?
It's kind of weird. Rob, do you want to give a kind of outline of what happens?
I can try.
Does anything happen, really? It's another one of those stories that doesn't.
It's another one of those stories
when
someone asks you to summarize, you're like, well, let me see. So it takes place in a place called Ghost Street. And there's a kid named simply Ning who is tended and cared for by ghosts. Ghosts who have a barcode on them suggesting that they were produced somehow for commercial use. And it's just sort of his halcyon days running around Ghost Street tended by ghosts until, effectively, Ghost Street, by the end of the story, this is sort of a giveaway, but there's no other way to say it, gets destroyed. Now, along the way, Ning overhears his two guardians talking about him. And it turns out that he's actually not a human being, like he thought, but is actually also a ghost. But in the context of the story, ghosts are things that have been made to serve a certain function, and Ning represents a more advanced copy. And so the last half of the story is him wondering, wait, so am I human? Am I not? And he is told by a sentient crow, interestingly enough, that the only way to know is effectively to die.
That's how I found out that I was human, too.
That's how you found out you weren't, because you're still doing the podcast. This explains so much of our podcast, the dynamic. One human and one non-human. Anyway, no giveaways. By the end of the story, Ning does figure out which one he is, and I won't tell you how that works out. But Ghost Street, a kid who finds out he may or may not be human, and a world that we know absolutely nothing about outside of Ghost Street, which is particularly strange.
And I wanted to describe that world because, Rob, your plot summary hinted at the fact that there's not much of a story in this story. The interesting thing about this story is more of the descriptiveness of Ghost Street. So you have Ning, at the very beginning of the story, he's reading the Huainanzi, which is a pre-Qin dynasty text that is kind of compiled on governance. So it's just a kind of early Chinese text written, I think, in the 3rd century BCE.
That is notable for bringing together a bunch of different strains of classical thought and trying to make them play nice together.
Yeah, so I mean, some text, some philosophical text that exist today exist only as quotes from the Huainanzi. So, like the youngest school of early Chinese thought, really only exist in the form that we have it. I believe in the Huainanzi. It doesn't have its own text. But more importantly, for our purposes, in talking about science fiction in the modern era, is that it's just this really old book that evokes a kind of classical Chineseness, this essentialized form of China way back when, and that's kind of what Ghost Street does as well. It's this very traditional feeling Chinese street, and I think it's interesting because you have this science fiction story, or supposed science fiction story. I don't know how much science fiction this is, and we can discuss that, Rob, but you have this story that's all about, like, it starts out with the main character reading a text on traditional China, from traditional China, and then you have these ghosts who are kind of doing all of these different activities. It feels very much like a street scene at a night market in Taipei, right? Like something that you don't really, something that has kind of disappeared, I would say, more in China itself, and it feels like much of this is just evoking a sort of Chineseness, which is interesting because they're all dead, right? Like obviously the ghosts are all dead, or I don't know exactly how to say it. The story doesn't really tell us if they're dead or if they are just manufactured as dead, these ghosts, but there is this sense that this classical Chinese identity is on a precipice, and it's just barely being preserved in its essence. And then you mentioned Ghost Street is destroyed. We should probably use the Chinese word here, right? It's chied, right? Like it's torn down. For the past 20 or 30 years, there's been this discussion in China of kind of preservation of traditional architecture and things like that, and how the state is largely tearing all of that down to develop things. And there has been some pushback, but mostly you can go anywhere in China and not know where you're at. There's so many cities that have just completely been destroyed in terms of traditional architecture. There's actually a phrase for it: 1,000 cities, one face. And I think that this story is kind of a nod to both traditional Chinese culture and traditional Chinese architecture being destroyed, because at the end, Ning is struggling to get away from a spider that's destroying...
Mechanical spider, yeah.
A mechanical spider, thank you. That's destroying much of Ghost Street, and all the ghosts are concerned because Rob, do they get eaten by the spider, or does the spider just destroy?
They just get demolished and I believe reprocessed somehow.
So there is this question of whether or not this is a statement about some sort of essentialized form of Chineseness being destroyed. Rob, the thing that I liked about the previous story from Invisible Planets that we did, the Year of the Rat, is that it said something that was so clearly political that you couldn't say in any context other than science fiction. I think that something similar is going on here, right? Like, this is, because it's science fiction, because it's categorized as science fiction, the author can make this very clear political statement, but because it's been packaged as science fiction, it doesn't come off as clearly political, so she can get away with it, right?
And she even says it in the context of toys, which I find fascinating, because in the context of the story, the ghosts are supposed to be, I believe, for commercial use, a little bit like the rats in Sun Xiufen's story. They start out as genetically modified animals for the luxury pet market. In this story, the ghosts, they have a barcode, they're supposed to be manufactured to do certain things. And one of Ning's guardians, Xia Jia, the narrator says, and it's been narrated in the first person, Ning writes this: Xia Jia once told me that Ghost Street's decline came about because people, real people, found more exciting, newer toys. Maybe I am one of those toys, made with newer or better technology, until I could pass for the real thing. Now, what's interesting about that is, like you say, in the context of a story that so clearly puts classical references right up front, to say, you know what? Maybe people have just moved on and found newer toys, right? New things to play with. The classical culture in the context of the story, it's just something people play with.
I'm glad you brought up that line because I actually interpreted that as a reference to sort of tourism and the state of Chinese tourism today, because the kinds of places that feel like quote unquote traditional China, and I recognize there are a lot of problems with using even that phrase, but let's just take as a given that the author is evoking some sort of traditional China. A lot of times when you find that in China, it's on these touristy streets, these laojie, the kind of old street that's been repackaged for the purposes of touristic consumption. And it seems interesting that she's making this point on this very touristy, like it there does seem to be something authentic on Ghost Street, but I'm not entirely sure what her point is. Is her point that people have found, tourists have found other kinds of places to go, or is it actually about toys? Rob, you were seeing, it seems like you're reading it as if they really are toys and Ning himself is just a better version of those toys. I struggled with how to interpret this.
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, in answer to that question, one of the ways to read this is, in fact, that what you mentioned, the Laojie, are themselves, how do I put this?
They're fake.
Ill-conceived ways of reviving the traditional culture, just as commercially manufactured ghosts from out of a story, kind of the same thing, you know? So even their dying out doesn't necessarily work. Now, I was also going to say, though, that the reason I suggested doing the story in the first place is about halfway through the story, I was like, I feel like I'm walking through like a museum of characters from Pu Songling's fiction or The Journey to the West. I mean, you have figures right out of these novels. You even have at one point during a big holiday festival, a yaksha, right? Which is
it's a demon imported from Indic Buddhism that plays a pretty prominent role in Chinese Buddhism as well.
And in Journey to the West, you have ghosts. Ghosts are all over Pu Songling. All over Pu Songling.
Yep.
And frequently with the same questions. Ghosts throughout Pu Songling are trying to become human. They're trying to cross over into the human realm. And there's a certain sadness in Xia Jia's story, too. The ghosts sort of wish they could still be who they once were. There's some suggestions that one or two of them, anyway, remember their past lives. Again, we're not told how they became what they were. But in the context of the story, these Pu Songling and Journey to the West type figures have what amount to very rich lives. They're not just tourist objects. They're very real things with feelings, with desires, with regrets. Two of Ning's guardians, or one of them anyway, wants to run off with the other. So they seem to still be fully functional beings, right? And the idea that they're just supposed to be toys sounds like the narrator saying, yeah, but are they really? Are these things just there to be sold off to tourists, or are they really much, much more than that?
I mean, the whole question of Ning not knowing his own identity, I think, plays into that interpretation, right, Rob? Like, these ghosts seem to know whether or not they're toys, or they seem to accept the fact that they're ersatz beings. But when we see them as characters, they're not ersatz at all. They're very real. They're very full. You're right. They're living very complete lives.
Yeah, and that's a good point. In the context of the story, they come alive, right? And so one of the things that's interesting about it is it feels like an impassioned argument about, well, just the power of stories. Like, why are we forgetting that these are real things, that these are the actual experience of a story can be something that transforms the characters within it to something more than they are on the paper.
So you're suggesting a kind of metatextual interpretation where the story is telling us that these are not real beings, but actually, as we read the story, we come to believe that the story is telling us something that's incorrect?
Not necessarily incorrect, but as a commentary on perhaps the way people are reading this older stuff now. Is it just there to be packaged off and sold as toys? A lot of Journey to the West gets done that way, right?
And there are tons of Journey to the West amusement parks, right?
Exactly.
Through, especially in Xinjiang, where they've been trying to develop tourism. I kind of want to take us back to the Huainanzi as we're wrapping up. Rob, the reading of the Huainanzi in this story, I think, clearly indicates that there's something going on, that the author is trying to do something with this idea of essential Chinese identity. What do you think this story says about that identity? Is it saying it's in danger of being destroyed, or is it even questioning whether or not that identity is itself real?
Well, one of the things that I see is less a firm statement about Chinese identity than on how the story looks at this question of how do we go about answering the question, who are we, whether Chinese or otherwise? Because she's drawing off of these fictional classics, and Pu Songling in particular loves to pose the question of, okay, how do you know you're different from the world of the spirits, right? So ghosts and fox spirits frequently in his stories get confused for human beings because they act just like them. And there are human beings who act less human than the ghosts. This also happens pretty frequently. And you can see him kind of muddying the waters, right? How do you actually know you're that different, right? In this story, too, it's exactly the same question, only this time it's in the context of a modern commercial environment. These things are being bought and sold. Are you really that different, right? Because if you're reading them as real beings, real people, and they feel like they're real people, what does it say about you?
Two things. So Pu Songling, we did a podcast on Pu Songling's story about a man in love with a rock, and the rock comes to seem as human, if not more human, than a lot of characters in fiction. So I definitely see your point connecting this story with Pu Songling. A question, Rob, is do you think this story is kind of about the way that commercialism and capitalism denatures humans? Is that what the spider... I mean, I'm interpreting the spider politically, the mechanical spider that destroys Ghost Street at the end, in terms of this sort of culture of CCP chaiing everything, getting rid of it, turning... ripping apart these essentialized traditional forms of both architecture and life. But it sounds almost like you're suggesting that the story is more about capitalism destroying this traditional Chinese identity.
I think there's room for both. I mean, I don't know how else you interpret the fact that all the ghosts have barcodes on their back. I mean, there has to be some connection to the modern commercial consumer world. But you're right. The idea that the traditional street is being chaied, is being demolished by mechanical creatures, it's kind of hard to distance ourselves from the political reading too. What I love about it is that it's a well-written enough story to leave you lots of room to wonder, which in my definition is what a good story is supposed to be. You're not supposed to finish and go, oh, I get it. Okay, let's move on. You're supposed to finish and go, okay, all right, what do I do with this, right? And I think the story definitely does that.
I agree with you, Rob, 100%. I think good writing leaves a lot of opportunities for interpretation open, or as we would say in comp lit circles, only bad stories foreclose on multiple interpretations. Right, Rob?
Yeah, except you're identifying yourself with us again, even though you badmouth us all the time. So
I do.
What's happening here is Elise jealous that he can't be included in our ranks. He just
in the
spent
cool
his years
kids at
studying old, literature. Dusty Chinese works that no one cares about. We study cutting edge stuff in comp lit.
Cutting edge literature. That's a phrase that should
Isn't
be
that
banned.
Great? I swear I've heard that before, and I feel like the first time I heard it, I went, "What? That's no." Anyway,
if you're talking about cutting edge literature, you don't understand literature.
No, you really don't. But I will say, in wrapping this up, because I think we've kind of talked about it enough. Xia Jia does. This is something that I find fascinating, not just with Xia Jia's fiction, but a lot of the Chinese science fiction I've read. There is a real effort to combine lots of different worlds that really only exist in China. This story could not have been written anywhere but in China. I mean, at least with the cast of characters that you have. I mean, obviously, there's a tradition of ghost fiction in a lot of cultures. You could put something different in there, but you wouldn't have yakshas. You wouldn't have some of the same stuff that you have in here. And it's interesting to see someone who is serious about science fiction as a genre, defined as loosely as you want, bringing in Pu Songling, because if you've read Pu Songling, it's not a stretch, really. Not at all, right? Pu Songling was way ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And so the first time I encountered the story, I went, that makes total sense that someone would do this. So I think you should check it out. Take the ride.
Yeah, just to go back to our discussion of cutting edge literature, would Xia Jia agree that there is no such thing as cutting edge literature, that you have to kind of be basing yourself in these older identities to really say anything that's worthwhile? I mean, even in writing science fiction, she is definitely, trying to base herself in Pu Songling and a lot of the older Chinese traditional literary genres.
I think I'd go more. I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Mingus, the jazz musician, but he was famous for just playing a little bit of everything: blues, gospel, avant-garde, whatever. But his perspective was, there's no such thing as old music or new music. If it's a good song, it doesn't matter if it's 500 years old. It's a good song. Who cares, right? And I think that's what I see at work here. Is it's not that Pu Songling is new or old. If it's good, use it.
And now that we've had our requisite reference to 20th century music, I think we can call it. I think we can call it a podcast. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.